The front door of the small blue house on Maple Hollow Road had not been opened by anyone but Margaret Ellsworth in 11 years, and so when the man standing on the porch that bright Saturday morning said the words, "I'm ready to be your husband again," it was not Margaret who answered him. It was a teenage boy with the same gray-green eyes as his own, a boy the man had never met, a boy who looked at him with the calm, unshaken confidence of someone standing in a home that was entirely his, and the man's face drained of all color as though someone had reached into his chest and pulled the breath straight out of him. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet miracles that happen when people find the courage to make things right, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Our community grows because of people like you, people who still believe that broken things can be mended, and that no one is ever too far gone to come home. Thomas Bennett had once been a man who kept his promises. That was the thing everyone in Millbrook used to say about him, back when he was 26 years old and freshly married to Margaret, a schoolteacher with a laugh like wind chimes and a stubborn, luminous kind of hope that made everyone around her want to be better. Thomas worked at the lumber yard on the edge of town, came home smelling like sawdust and sweat, and every single evening for the first 4 years of their marriage, he would stand at the door, take off his boots, and say the same thing before he even said hello, "I'm here. I made it back to you." It became a kind of ritual between them, a small vow repeated so many times it stopped sounding like words and started sounding like a heartbeat. Then came the accident at the mill, the one that crushed 2 vertebrae in his back and left him dependent on pain medication that the doctors handed out far too freely in those days. Thomas did not set out to become a man who broke promises. No man ever does. It happened slowly, the way rust happens, a little at first, invisible, and then suddenly the whole structure is compromised and nobody can quite say when it started. The pills led to more pills. The pain in his back became an excuse, and then the excuse became a habit, and the habit swallowed the man whole until Margaret was left standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding their 4-year-old son Caleb on her hip, watching her husband stumble through the door unable to remember his own name. She gave him 3 chances. 3. She was a patient woman, but patience is not the same as endlessness, and there came a night, cold and merciless, when Thomas did not come home at all, and Margaret sat by the window until the sun came up, and when it did, something in her chest closed like a door that had finally had enough of being kicked in. She packed 2 suitcases. She took Caleb, then 5 years old, and she moved 3 towns away to Millbrook, back to the house her grandmother had left her, the little blue house with the crooked porch step and the lilac bush by the mailbox. She never filed for divorce. She always said, in the quiet, private corner of her heart she showed no one, that filing for divorce would have felt like giving up on the idea that people could change, and Margaret Ellsworth did not like giving up on things, even things that had already broken her. Thomas did not come looking for them. Not at first. He told himself it was because he loved them too much to let them see what he had become, but the truth, the uglier truth he would only admit to himself many years later in the quiet of a rented room above a hardware store, was that shame is its own kind of prison, and it is far easier to disappear into your own ruin than to climb back out and face the people who watched you fall. 2 years became 4. 4 became 7. Somewhere in there, Thomas hit a bottom so absolute that he found himself sleeping behind a gas station in a town he didn't recognize, and it was there, in that particular darkness, that something in him finally cracked open in the right direction instead of the wrong one. A pastor named Walter Higgins found him that morning, half frozen, feverish, and instead of walking past him the way so many others had, Walter crouched down, looked him in the eye, and asked him his name. Thomas would later say that single question, asked with something other than disgust, was the first stone in the long road back. Walter got him into a recovery program run out of the back of a church in a nearby county. It was not glamorous. There were no easy miracles. There were months of shaking hands and sleepless nights and moments where Thomas wanted so badly to disappear again that he could taste it, bitter and metallic, at the back of his throat. But he stayed. Day after day, he stayed, and slowly, the man who kept his promises began, very carefully, to rebuild himself from the inside out. It took him 4 years of sobriety before he felt he had earned the right to even think about Margaret and Caleb without flinching. He got a steady job managing inventory at a hardware supply warehouse. He paid off old debts one by one, methodically, like a man defusing a bomb he had planted himself. He wrote letters he never sent. He attended meetings twice a week, sometimes 3 times, and he spoke, when it was his turn, about a wife with a laugh like wind chimes and a son whose face he had memorized from a single photograph he'd kept folded in his wallet through every version of his ruin. He was, by the time he turned 43, a different man in every way that mattered, and yet the guilt of what he had done to that small family never fully left him. It simply changed shape, from a wound into a compass, pointing him steadily toward the one act of courage he had been too afraid to attempt for 11 long years, going home. It was his sponsor, a soft-spoken widower named Arthur Doyle, who finally told him plainly one evening over coffee that courage delayed indefinitely was simply another name for cowardice, however gently earned. "You've done the work, Thomas," Arthur said. "The only thing left is to show up and let the truth speak for itself. You don't get to decide if they forgive you. You only get to decide if you show up honest." Those words rattled around in Thomas's chest for 3 sleepless nights before he finally packed a small bag, filled his truck with gas, and began the 4-hour drive to Millbrook, a town he had not set foot in since the year Caleb turned 5. He rehearsed the speech the entire drive. He imagined Margaret's face 100 different ways, sometimes soft with forgiveness, sometimes hard as stone, sometimes simply weary, the way a person looks when they have cried every possible tear over something and have nothing left to give it. He imagined Caleb as a boy of 9 or 10, still small, still the age he had last seen him, because that was the only version of his son that existed in his memory, frozen like a photograph that time had refused to update. What Thomas had not properly accounted for, what no amount of rehearsal could have prepared him for, was the simple, devastating truth that 11 years is an entire lifetime for a child. Caleb was no longer 5. He was 16 now, nearly 17, 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with his father's exact jawline and his mother's watchful green-gray eyes, and it was this boy, this near stranger who happened to share his blood, who opened the door of the little blue house on Maple Hollow Road when Thomas knocked that Saturday morning. For a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Thomas had rehearsed his opening lines so many times that it came out of him almost involuntarily, the words tumbling free before his mind had fully processed what his eyes were telling him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice cracking down the middle like dry wood, "to be your husband again." He had meant it for Margaret. He had pictured her face on the other side of that door 1,000 times on the drive over, and so his mouth simply said the sentence he'd prepared, even as his brain scrambled to catch up with the fact that the person standing in the doorway was not a woman in her 40s with faint lines at the corners of her eyes, but a teenage boy in a faded gray hoodie, holding a video game controller loosely in one hand, staring at him with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and dawning. Terrible recognition. Thomas turned deathly pale. It was not a figure of speech in that moment, the blood actually seemed to leave his face all at once, the way color drains from a photograph left too long in the sun. He knew, with the specific, sickening certainty that only a father could feel, exactly who was standing in front of him, and the knowledge arrived not as a gentle realization but as a physical blow, because standing there was not merely his son, grown into a near man without him, but living, breathing proof of every year Thomas had missed, every birthday he had not attended, every scraped knee he had not kissed, every school play and little league game and quiet bedtime story that had happened. In a world where Thomas Bennett simply did not exist. Caleb, for his part, went very still, the controller slipping slightly in his grip, his eyes narrowing not in anger yet, but in the careful, guarded way of someone doing rapid arithmetic with a memory he wasn't sure he trusted. "Dad?" Caleb said finally, and the word came out strange in his mouth, unpracticed, like a language he had once known fluently and had almost, but not quite, forgotten. It was not a word of welcome. It was a word of confirmation, spoken the way you might say the name of a stranger you recognize from an old photograph, testing whether the resemblance is real or whether your mind is simply playing tricks on you because you wanted, somewhere deep down, for it to be true. Thomas found that his voice had abandoned him entirely. He had planned an entire speech for Margaret, sentences he had practiced in the bathroom mirror of his rented apartment, sentences about accountability and time and the specific shape of his regret, and every single one of those words evaporated the instant he understood that his son, this tall stranger with his father's jaw, was the one who would hear them first. Caleb, he managed at last, and just saying the name out loud after 11 years broke something loose in his chest, a pressure he had been holding so long he had forgotten it was there. Caleb, I'm so sorry. I didn't know you'd be the one to open the door. I came for your mother. He stopped. He realized, standing there on the porch step with his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, that there was no sentence he could offer that would be adequate to the moment, that no rehearsed speech could account for the fact that the boy in front of him was not the child he had abandoned but an entirely new person, forged in 11 years of Thomas's absence, and Thomas had no idea who that person was. From somewhere inside the house, a voice called out, warm and unhurried, asking Caleb who was at the door, and Thomas heard it the way a drowning man hears the shore, both a comfort and a threat, because it was Margaret's voice, older now, softer at the edges in a way that came from years rather than fatigue, but unmistakably hers. The same voice that used to sing to him in the kitchen when they were young and foolish and certain nothing could ever break them. Caleb did not answer her right away. He kept staring at Thomas, and Thomas watched a series of emotions move across his son's face in rapid succession, the way weather moves across an open field, confusion giving way to something like anger, and the anger giving way, just for a flicker of a second, to something achingly close to hope, before the boy's expression closed over again like a door swinging shut. It's nobody, Mom, Caleb finally called back over his shoulder, though his eyes never left his father's face, and the words landed on Thomas like a verdict. Nobody. 11 years distilled down to a single syllable spoken by his own son. He deserved it, he told himself. He had rehearsed forgiveness in his mind so many times on the drive over that he had almost convinced himself he was entitled to some measure of it simply for having shown up, but standing there on the porch, hearing his son call him nobody, he understood with total clarity that he was entitled to nothing at all. Whatever grace might come to him would have to be earned one honest moment at a time, starting now, starting with a boy who owed him nothing and had every right to close this door in his face. But Caleb did not close the door. He stood there another long moment, chewing the inside of his cheek, a habit Thomas recognized with a jolt because it was the exact same habit Margaret's own father used to have, passed down through blood in a way that had nothing to do with the years Thomas had missed. Then, in a voice that trembled slightly despite his obvious effort to keep it steady, Caleb said, "You look different than the picture." Thomas blinked, uncertain what he meant, and Caleb continued, quieter now, almost to himself. "Mom has a picture. From your wedding. It's the only one we kept. You look different now. Older. Thinner." He paused, and something in his throat worked visibly as he swallowed. "She used to talk to that picture sometimes. When she thought I was asleep." Thomas felt his knees nearly give out beneath him. He had imagined many possible receptions on the long drive to Millbrook, imagined Margaret's fury, imagined her tears, imagined even the possibility that she had moved on entirely and built a new life with someone else, a possibility that had terrified him more than any other, but he had never once imagined this, a son who had grown up on stories and a single photograph, who had apparently absorbed his mother's private grief the way children do, quietly, without ever being told to, simply by living close enough to it to feel its weight. "I didn't know that," Thomas said, and his voice broke fully this time, no longer able to hold its careful composure. "I didn't know she kept a picture. I didn't know she—" He stopped himself, aware that he had no right to ask what Margaret had or had not felt in his absence, no right to any information about her inner life that she had not chosen to give him herself. It was at that moment that Margaret appeared behind her son in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression open and curious in the unguarded way of someone who has not yet been given a reason to brace herself. Thomas watched her face change in real time, watched the towel slip from her fingers to the floor, watched 11 years collapse in an instant as recognition hit her like a wave against a shore that had spent over a decade building its defenses and discovered, in this single moment, that no defense had been strong enough after all. She did not scream. She did not cry, not immediately. She simply stood very still, one hand rising slowly to cover her mouth, her eyes moving over Thomas's face the way you might study a familiar landscape after a long absence, searching for what has changed and what, impossibly, has stayed the same. "Thomas," she said at last, and his name in her mouth after 11 years of silence undid something in him completely. His knees did buckle then, just slightly, and he had to grip the porch railing to steady himself, and he became aware, distantly, that he was crying, that tears were running freely down a face that had not allowed itself to cry in years, not even during the hardest nights of his recovery, not even when he had hit the absolute bottom of himself behind that gas station. Something about seeing her, about hearing his own name spoken in her voice, cracked open a reservoir he had not known was still full. "I know I have no right," Thomas said, the words tumbling out now in a rush, as though if he did not say them immediately he would lose his nerve entirely and turn and walk back to his truck and drive away and never find the courage again. "I know I have no right to be standing on this porch. I know what I did. I know what I put you through, both of you, and I am not here to ask you to forget any of it, because I haven't forgotten any of it either, not one single day of it. I've been sober for 4 years, Margaret. 4 years and 31 days, actually. Not that the exact number should mean anything to you, but it means everything to me, because every single one of those days I thought about you and about him," he gestured toward Caleb, who had not moved from the doorway, "and about what I threw away because I was too much of a coward to fight for it while I was drowning, and too much of a coward for years afterward to face what I'd done. I'm not asking you to take me back. I know that's not something you owe me. I'm asking only for the chance to be in the same room as the two of you long enough to say I'm sorry properly, the way it deserves to be said, and after that, whatever you decide, I will accept it. I just couldn't spend one more year of my life a coward." The porch fell silent except for the distant sound of a lawnmower somewhere down the street and the soft rustle of the lilac bush in the morning breeze. Margaret stood there for a long moment, her hand still pressed against her mouth, and Thomas watched her chest rise and fall in slow, deliberate breaths, the way a person breathes when they are trying very hard not to fall apart in front of an audience. Finally she lowered her hand, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than Thomas had any right to expect. "You should come inside," she said. "Not because I've decided anything. Not because 11 years disappear because you stood on my porch and cried. But because whatever this is, whatever conversation needs to happen, it shouldn't happen with the whole street able to see it through the window." She stepped back from the door, and Caleb, after a long hesitation, did the same, though his eyes remained fixed on his father with an expression that was not quite trust and not quite hostility, but something raw and unresolved caught between the two. The inside of the house was smaller than Thomas remembered from the life they'd shared together, though of course it was not the same house at all. This was Margaret's grandmother's house, the one she'd fled to, and Thomas had never once set foot inside it. It smelled of cinnamon and old wood, and there were photographs on the walls, dozens of them, chronicling a childhood Thomas had missed in its entirety: Caleb's first day of kindergarten, a gap-toothed grin at what must have been 7 or 8, a Little League uniform, a school science fair ribbon, a graduation photo from middle school. Thomas moved through the hallway like a man walking through a museum dedicated to a life he should have been part of, and each photograph landed on him like a small, precise wound, not vicious, but honest, showing him exactly the shape and size of everything he had lost. They sat in the kitchen, the same room, Thomas realized with an ache, where Margaret must have made breakfast every morning for 11 years, where Caleb had done homework at the very table Thomas now sat at, his hands folded tightly in his lap to keep them from shaking. Margaret made coffee without being asked, an old habit neither of them commented on, and Caleb hovered near the doorway for a while before finally, tentatively, taking a seat at the far end of the table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to bolt if he needed to. "I want you to understand something first," Margaret said, once the coffee had been poured and the three of them sat in the strange, charged quiet of a reunion none of them had fully prepared for. "I never hated you, Thomas. I want to say that plainly, because I think you might have spent 11 years assuming I did, and building your guilt around that assumption. I was angry. God, I was angry for years. But hate is a different thing, and I never let myself go there, because hate would have meant giving up entirely on the man I married, and some stubborn part of me never wanted to do that, even when every practical part of me knew I had to protect my son and myself from what you'd become. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug, not drinking it, simply holding it, the way people hold on to things to steady themselves. But not hating you and being ready to simply open my door and let you back into our lives are two very different things. I need you to understand that too. Thomas nodded, and it took him a moment to trust his voice enough to speak. I understand, he said. I'm not here expecting anything to be simple. I know I don't get to walk back into your lives and have everything be the way it might have been if I'd never left. I know Caleb doesn't owe me a relationship just because I share his blood. I came because I needed you both to hear directly from me, in my own voice, that I am sorry, and that the man who left is not the man sitting at this table, and I wanted the chance to prove that over time, if you'll let me, rather than just say it once and expect it to mean something on its own. He looked at Caleb then, who had been silent the entire time, watching his father with an intensity that made Thomas's chest ache. Caleb, I know an apology can't undo 11 birthdays. It can't undo the nights you probably wondered why your dad didn't want you. And I need you to know, whatever you decide to feel about me from this day forward, that the not wanting you was never true, not for one single day, even during the very worst of it. I was ashamed. I thought staying away was protecting you from watching me fall apart. I understand now that it was actually a different kind of failure, maybe a worse one, because at least if I'd stayed you'd have known, for certain, that I loved you, even while I was struggling. Caleb's jaw tightened, and for a moment Thomas feared the boy would simply stand and leave the room, unwilling to hear any more. Instead, Caleb asked a question that cut straight through 11 years of careful rehearsal and hit Thomas somewhere far more vulnerable than any of the speeches he'd prepared. Did you ever try to find us? He asked. In all that time. Did you ever drive by? Did you ever call? Did you ever, I don't know, send a birthday card, even one you didn't sign, just so I'd know you remembered the date? His voice cracked on the last few words, and Thomas understood, with a sudden, devastating clarity, that this was the real wound, larger even than the drinking, larger than the pills, larger than everything that had come before, the silence. The 11 years of nothing. A father who had simply vanished, leaving a boy to wonder, every single year on his birthday, whether he had been forgotten entirely or simply never mattered enough to be remembered. Thomas felt the honest answer catch in his throat, because the honest answer was complicated and shameful in its own particular way. I thought about it every year, he said slowly, forcing himself to hold his son's gaze even though every instinct told him to look away. Every single birthday, I thought about sending something. And every single year, I talked myself out of it, and I want to be honest with you about why, because you deserve honesty more than you deserve an excuse that makes me sound better than I was. I told myself that showing up, even just with a card, without being sober, without being someone worth knowing, would only hurt you more. I told myself I was protecting you. But if I'm being completely truthful, some of it was also fear. Fear that you'd already stopped thinking of me as your father at all, and that reaching out would just prove to both of us how far gone I really was. It wasn't a good reason. It wasn't even really a reason at all. It was cowardice wearing the mask of consideration, and I only understood that clearly once I'd been sober long enough to look back at those years honestly instead of through the fog I'd been living in. The kitchen was quiet again, filled only with the soft tick of a clock on the wall and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Margaret watched her son carefully, the way a mother watches a child navigating something too large for easy comfort, ready to step in but choosing, for now, to let him find his own way through it. Caleb stared down at the table, his jaw working, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, though his voice remained fierce, almost defiant, as though daring the tears to fall. Do you know what it's like, he said, to have kids at school ask where your dad is, and you don't have an answer that doesn't sound pathetic? For years I told people you were dead, because that felt easier than the truth. It felt easier to say my dad died than to say my dad chose drugs over me. The words landed in the room like something physical, and Thomas absorbed them the way you absorb a blow you know you deserve, without flinching, without protest, simply letting it hit. "I'm sorry," Thomas said again, because there was truly nothing else adequate to say, and repeating it felt insufficient and necessary all at once. "I'm sorry you had to carry that. I'm sorry you had to build a story to protect yourself from the real one. You shouldn't have had to do that. A father is supposed to be the one who protects his son from having to invent easier truths, not the reason he needs one." He felt his own eyes burning again, and this time he did not fight it, let the tears simply fall, unashamed, because shame had cost him 11 years already and he was done letting it dictate what he allowed himself to feel in front of his family. "I can't go back and be there for those years. I would give anything, everything I have, to be able to. But I'm here now, and I'm sober, and I'm not going anywhere again, not unless you tell me to, and even then I think I'd still find some way to prove to you, slowly, over time, that I mean it, because you deserve proof, not promises. You've had enough empty promises from me to last a lifetime." It was Margaret who spoke next, her voice quiet but steady, the voice of a woman who had done a great deal of thinking over 11 long years about exactly what she would say if this moment ever arrived. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple," she said. "I'm not going to pretend that you showing up on our porch this morning undoes what happened, or that I trust you the way I once did, because trust like that doesn't come back just because someone says the right words. But I will say this. I watched you struggle for years before you disappeared, Thomas, and even in the worst of it, even on the nights I was so exhausted and so afraid that I could barely see straight, I never once believed you were a bad man. I believed you were a sick man, and there's a difference, even if the difference didn't make our life together survivable at the time. I left because I had to protect Caleb, and because I had reached the end of what I could carry alone. Not because I stopped believing you had good in you somewhere underneath all of it." She paused, wrapping her hands more tightly around the coffee mug, her eyes distant for a moment as though she were looking through the kitchen window at something only she could see. "I kept that photograph," she continued, "because some stubborn, foolish part of me never fully let go of the man in it. I used to talk to it sometimes, late at night, after Caleb was asleep, not because I expected an answer, but because saying things out loud to that photograph felt less lonely than saying them to an empty room. I'd tell it about Caleb's day at school, about the ribbon he won at the science fair, about the time he broke his arm falling out of the oak tree in the backyard. I told that photograph everything, for years, the way you might write in a journal you never expect anyone to read. I think, if I'm honest with myself, some part of me was keeping you updated, even though you weren't there to receive any of it. Maybe that was my own way of refusing to give up on the idea that someday you might come back and want to know all of it." Thomas felt something in his chest crack fully open at her words, a grief so specific and so tender that he had to press the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes before he could speak again. "I don't deserve that kind of hope," he said quietly. "But I am endlessly grateful you had it in you anyway." He looked between Margaret and Caleb, and for the first time since he had knocked on that door, he allowed himself to feel something other than fear and shame, a small, fragile flicker of something that might, with time and enormous care, grow into hope of his own. "I don't expect either of you to simply hand me back everything I lost. I don't even think that would be right, honestly, not without time, not without me proving through actions, not words, that I've actually changed. But if you'll let me, I would like the chance to start. Slowly. However slowly you both need. Coffee sometimes. A phone call. Showing up to things, if you'll have me, and not disappearing again if it gets hard, because I understand now that disappearing when things get hard is exactly the wound I need to spend the rest of my life proving I'm capable of not repeating." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning his water glass slowly between his hands, his young face working through something far too large and far too complicated for a boy his age to have been forced to reckon with. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier sharpness, replaced by something more exhausted, more uncertain, the sound of a person who has been angry for so long that he isn't entirely sure what to do with the sudden possibility of not being angry anymore. "I don't know how to just be okay with this," he admitted. "I've spent so long being mad at you that I don't really know what I'm supposed to feel now that you're actually sitting here. Part of me wants to tell you to leave and never come back, because that would be easier, in a weird way, than trying to figure out what to do with you being here." He looked up, and his eyes, so like his father's, held a fragile, guarded honesty. "But another part of me, and I hate this part a little, keeps thinking about how you said you thought about my birthday every single year. And I don't know what to do with that either, because it means you didn't forget me, even when I convinced myself you had." "I never forgot you," Thomas said, his voice breaking completely now. "Not for one single hour of one single day. You were the reason I finally got sober, Caleb. Not the only reason, but the deepest one. Somewhere in the very worst of it, I had this thought that wouldn't leave me alone, this image of you finding out one day that your father had died in some gutter somewhere without ever trying to become someone worth knowing, and I couldn't survive that thought. It's what got me into that church basement. It's what kept me coming back to those meetings on nights I wanted so badly to quit. Every single day I've been sober, some part of it has been for you, even during the years I was too ashamed to reach out and tell you that." The three of them sat in silence for a long while after that, the kind of silence that isn't empty but full, weighted with everything that had just been said and everything still unspoken that would need years, not minutes, to work through. Eventually Margaret rose and refilled the coffee, and the small, ordinary gesture seemed to loosen something in the room, allowing the three of them to breathe a little easier, as though the worst of the confrontation had passed and what remained now was simply the slow, uncertain work of figuring out what came next. They talked for hours that morning, moving from the kitchen table eventually to the back porch, where the late spring sun warmed the worn wooden boards and a pair of sparrows hopped along the fence line, indifferent to the enormity of what was unfolding a few feet away. Thomas told them, honestly and without flinching, about the years he had spent lost, about the gas station and Pastor Walter Higgins, about the church basement meetings and the slow, grinding work of rebuilding a self-worth trusting. He did not romanticize any of it. He did not ask for pity. He simply told the truth, plainly, the way Arthur Doyle had taught him to, understanding that trust could only be rebuilt on a foundation of complete honesty, not carefully curated half-truths designed to make himself look better than he had been. Margaret, in turn, told him some of what those 11 years had held for her and Caleb, not all of it, not yet, some of it too private and too hard-won to hand over freely in a single morning, but enough for Thomas to begin to understand the shape of the life they had built without him. She told him about the 2 jobs she'd worked when Caleb was young, about the long nights of grading papers after he'd gone to bed, about the slow, painful process of teaching herself not to flinch every time the phone rang late at night, afraid it might be news of Thomas, one way or another. She told him, too, about the good things, carefully, almost shyly, as though unsure whether Thomas had earned the right to hear them yet, about Caleb's love of building model airplanes, about the summer he'd spent teaching himself guitar in the garage, about the quiet, steady kindness he'd shown his grandmother in her final illness 2 years earlier, sitting with her every day after school even when it clearly exhausted him. Caleb listened to his mother speak about him with a kind of embarrassed pride, ducking his head, but Thomas noticed, with a small ache of gratitude, that the boy did not leave the porch, did not retreat to his room, did not shut the conversation down the way he might have an hour earlier. Something had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, in the last few hours, not full forgiveness, not yet, but a willingness, however cautious, to keep the door open a little longer and see what might walk through it. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret excused herself briefly to answer a phone call from a neighbor, and for the first time since Thomas had arrived, he found himself alone on the porch with his son. The silence between them was awkward at first, heavy with everything that had already been said and everything still too large to say. It was Caleb who finally broke it, staring out at the yard rather than at his father, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier defiance. "Can I ask you something?" he said, and Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice to hold steady. "Do you think you'll stay sober?" Like, really stay, not just for a few years and then fall apart again? Because I don't think I could handle getting used to having a dad around and then losing him again. I think that might actually break something in me that wouldn't fix. Thomas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, understanding that a flippant reassurance would mean nothing to a boy who had already learned, the hardest way possible, that promises from his father were not to be trusted blindly. I can't promise you it'll be easy, he said carefully. Recovery isn't a single decision you make once and then never think about again. It's something I choose every single day, sometimes every single hour, especially in the beginning, and even now, 4 years in, there are still hard days. What I can promise you is that I'm not doing this alone anymore, the way I was before. I have people, a sponsor, a community, folks who know exactly what to say to me on the days it gets hard, and who I'm not afraid to call at 2 in the morning if I need to. That wasn't true the first time around. I thought I could white-knuckle my way through everything by myself, and that's part of why I failed you both so badly. I won't make that same mistake again. And I want you to know, if you ever do let me back into your life in a real way, I would want you to feel like you could ask me this same question anytime you needed to, without me getting defensive or angry about it. You deserve to feel safe asking it, for as long as you need to ask it. Caleb nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders seemed to loosen, just slightly, the tension he had been carrying since he first opened the door easing by some small but perceptible degree. They sat together in a silence that felt, for the first time that day, almost comfortable, watching the sparrows dart along the fence line, and when Margaret returned from her phone call a few minutes later, she found them there, not talking, but sitting together in a way that suggested the beginning of something neither of them had words for yet. The days that followed were not a fairy tale, and Thomas never expected them to be. He drove back to his rented room above the hardware store that evening, and he did not hear from Margaret again for nearly a week, a silence that tested every ounce of patience his years of recovery had taught him to hold on to. He did not call her repeatedly. He did not show up unannounced again. He simply waited, trusting that the seed planted on that porch would need time to take root, if it was going to take root at all, and that pushing too hard, too fast, would only confirm every fear Caleb had voiced about a father who could not be trusted to respect boundaries. When Margaret finally called, it was to ask if he would like to come to Caleb's baseball game that Saturday, nothing more, nothing less, simply an invitation extended cautiously, like a hand offered to someone standing at the edge of a narrow bridge. Thomas said yes before she had even finished the sentence, and he arrived early, sitting alone in the bleachers at first, uncertain of his place, until Margaret arrived with a thermos of coffee and sat beside him without a word, an act of quiet grace that meant more to Thomas than any speech could have. Caleb played well that day, and though he did not look toward the bleachers often, Thomas noticed, each time their eyes did meet, a flicker of something uncertain but no longer hostile, something that might, with enough patience, grow eventually into trust. After the game, walking to the parking lot, Caleb approached his father directly for the first time since the day on the porch and asked, almost shyly, if Thomas would want to get a burger sometime, just the two of them, no big production, just to talk. Thomas said yes, and had to turn away briefly to hide the fact that he was crying again, unable to fully believe that such an ordinary invitation could feel like the single greatest gift he had ever received. Over the months that followed, the relationship between Thomas and his family rebuilt itself slowly, deliberately, brick by careful brick, the way any structure worth trusting must be built. There were setbacks. There was a difficult evening, 3 months in, when Caleb, frustrated after a hard day at school, lashed out at his father with all the accumulated anger of 11 years, telling him he still didn't fully believe any of it was real, that some part of him was still waiting for Thomas to disappear again the way he always had. Thomas did not defend himself or grow angry in return. He simply listened, absorbed the anger without flinching, and told his son, calmly and honestly, that he understood why the fear remained, and that he intended to keep showing up, day after day, for as long as it took for that fear to finally, fully, quiet itself. He did not ask Caleb to forgive him on any particular timeline. He simply kept his word, showing up to every baseball game, every awkward dinner, every small ordinary Tuesday that slowly, cumulatively, began to prove to his son that this version of his father was not a temporary reprieve but a permanent return. Margaret, too, kept a careful distance for a long while, unwilling to rush back into anything resembling romance, aware that her own heart needed protecting as much as her son's did. She and Thomas began, slowly, to talk more openly, not as husband and wife reuniting, but as two people who shared a history and a son and were cautiously, tentatively, feeling out what honesty and time might allow to grow between them again. It was nearly a year before Margaret allowed herself to acknowledge, quietly, to a close friend over coffee, that she thought she might be falling in love with the man Thomas had become, someone both familiar and entirely new, someone who had earned, through 1,000 small consistent acts rather than a single grand gesture, the right to be trusted again. It was on a bright afternoon almost 14 months after that first knock on the door, with the lilac bush in full bloom and Caleb, now 17, leaning against the porch railing with the easy posture of a boy who had finally stopped bracing for his father to vanish, that Thomas asked Margaret, quietly and without ceremony, whether she might consider, someday, allowing him to truly come home, not as a man begging for forgiveness, but as a partner who had proven himself worthy of being trusted with a future. Margaret did not answer immediately. She looked past him, at Caleb on the porch, who offered the smallest, almost imperceptible nod, a silent blessing passed from son to mother, and when Margaret finally turned back to Thomas, her eyes were wet but her smile was real, entirely real, in a way it had not been in over a decade. "Yes," she said simply. "I think I would like that very much." They did not rush the wedding, choosing instead a quiet ceremony the following spring in the very backyard where father and son had first begun to rebuild their bond over quiet conversations on worn porch boards. Caleb stood beside his father that day, not as a groomsman in the traditional sense, but as something far more significant, a witness to the fact that broken things, given enough honesty and enough time, really can be mended into something even stronger than what was lost. Pastor Walter Higgins, the man who had once knelt beside a broken stranger behind a gas station and asked his name, traveled 3 hours to officiate the ceremony, and when he spoke of grace and second chances, there was not a dry eye among the small gathering of family and friends who had watched this particular story unfold. If this story touched your heart even a little, we would be so grateful if you took a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Before we close, we would love to hear from you. What do you think it truly takes to earn back trust after so much has been broken, and have you ever witnessed forgiveness that seemed impossible until the moment it actually happened? Please share your thoughts with our community below, because stories like this one grow more powerful every time they are passed from one heart to another. Years later, when Caleb was a grown man himself, with a family of his own, he would tell the story of that Saturday morning to his own children, the day a stranger with his father's face had knocked on the door and said words meant for someone else entirely, words that had, against every reasonable expectation, turned out to be true after all. He would tell them about the version of his father who had been lost for so many years, and the version who had found his way home, not through a single miraculous moment, but through 1,000 small, patient, honest days that added up, slowly and steadily, to something that finally deserved to be called forgiveness. And he would tell them, too, about the photograph his mother had kept all those years, the one she had spoken to in the quiet hours of so many lonely nights, because he had come, in time, to understand that hope, however foolish it might sometimes seem, is very often the thing that keeps a door unlocked long enough for someone to finally come home.